However, there are other instances. For instance, I found Phoenix, Arizona. Have you all heard of famous Sheriff Joe Arpaio?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. As one of the persons whom I interviewed said, she's like he was a sadist long before he was recognized for all of the dastardly things that he's doing right now. So people there have been fighting against him for a really, really long time. But he actually, what is going on there now, I was talking with some folks who are organizing in neighborhoods where he's conducting neighborhood sweeps. And people, rather than just trying to keep their head down, as they're doing in some places, are saying, you know what, all bets are off. You know, my neighbors are getting taken away, my loved ones are being taken away. There's no, and they're being organized. And so that's where I see this really hopeful possibility of, like, there are limits to organizing through and disorganizing through fear and terrorism. So these are sort of these defensive struggles that I think we can recognize some capacity building in and some recognition of what's going on. And I also think, and maybe this isn't a useful distinction, but there are these productive things that people are doing as well in terms of creating the capacities to not only survive and continue surviving and trying to create the lives and love relationships and family relationships and community relationships that they want. But that I think, that I would like to be able to see, to sort of amplify those and articulate those as a sort of abolitionist economy. That's just how I'm thinking about it. And so these little sort of green shoots, we might say, these little green shoots, you can see in terms of, okay, well, what is it that people whose labor power has been legally stripped from them through felon disenfranchisement or through immigration policy? Well, what do people do? So people work under the table, certainly, but people also are forming their own cooperatives, in order to make their own work and sell their services. People are turning to mutual aid. People are creating their own businesses, right? These are these little ways in which people are trying to create their own ways of getting on in the world that I think can be part of this sort of broader ways. I think those can be amplified. I'll just leave it with that. All right. So in terms of then the immigrant justice movement, and I'll just sort of speak to that because I think that one of the things I did find is that there aren't as many cross currents between prison abolition and immigrant justice organizing that I'd like to see. So that's something I'm going to be working on, and lots of people are working on. And I think that young people definitely are getting it a lot more readily because young people are experiencing both criminalization and family separation through immigration policy, and are just recognize that these policies working together very intimately. But in terms of the sort of immigrant justice movement, I think one of the things that I think Craig was speaking to in terms of some of the sort of main institutional forms in the immigrant justice movement. I mean, a lot of times they're sort of acting as they're just going to offer up sacrifice on one level. The sort of policy proposals that are being floated are completely, in terms of immigration reform, are completely leaving off the table border militarization. That's millions of people along the border who are immigrants and non-immigrants alike. That's just being left off the table. Likewise, the ways in which immigrant detention is being formalized as the newest prison system is also being left off the table. And at the grassroots, people are pissed off. They're not exactly wanting to be sacrificed in those ways. And so I think there is a real sort of split there in terms of that movement. And so this question of who it is who is at the table, who it is who's making these deals, is that's going on. And so the final sort of thing I'd like to say is that I really appreciate being here because part of what was so difficult about this trip, I mean, the grayness of detention centers is oppressive, and the sort of the feeling of the permanency of low intensity conflict being built into the ground is visceral. But part of what made that difficult too is that I was in California when young people, were having a protest around demanding they wanted education funding rather than prison funding, for instance, right? And so at this very moment, the institutions that I went to school in and got my education, I was able to get some of these ideas, read some of these ideas, and come to be able to have some recognition of the value of thinking as a sort of class project for that I'm part of is being dismantled, right? And so that's part of or that sort of labor being alienated to such an extent that I don't even want to take part of it. Mm-hmm. And that's an incredibly, to be alienated from my own intellect is incredibly painful. I'm not sure if maybe other people have felt that way. And so to be here in this room and really feel the vitality of people taking on ideas and theorizing as really, really important to what is going on, I'm grateful for, so thank you. And that's really what one feels also in the midst of this sort of border region. So I was there on the border, and this completely unlikely crew of folks who had come together on the border region, some of whom doing humanitarian work, and the people on whose land we had the camp, the No More Death camp set up. Totally unlikely crew of people, from libertarians to humanitarian folks to church folks to anti-border folks, et cetera, and yet recognizing each other as involved in a similar sort of project of not wanting the feds to be doing what they're doing, of destroying somebody else and destroying a sort of land, even of territories that they love. And so actually then creating on some level, and again, maybe I'll be called idealistic or utopian on this, but this is how I wake up in the morning.
They call you romantic.
I am a romantic, and I'll wake up in the morning that way. And so yeah, really also holding on to that is something that people do create, and that is something that people do create in the midst of that violence. And so that's part of what I feel here too. So thank you.
Thanks to everybody who started us off. That last from Jenna was a lucky 13 minutes, so may that bode well for our dirty dozen of discussion. And please, I recommend, I mean, you speak as you will freely choose yourselves, but I just recommend that you might consider beginning with your ultimate point, and then filling that in a little bit as you feel is necessary for full engagement with your statement. And that would allow more people to speak. So I think, yes?
I guess I have a question primarily for the last person who spoke, Jenna, right? I've actually recently been a little bit involved with, support work around immigrant justice organizing, and I guess it's really great to hear that specific piece of analysis about trying to understand this relationship between prison abolition and immigrant justice work. And it's interesting because I feel like the sort of where people I've worked with seem to be at in terms of their organizational directions is, people who, not just people, or I forget the phrase used, not even people who are directly affected, but people who are paid organizers also feel deeply disillusioned at times by the organizational platforms at the places they work. Something that came up in an earlier presentation. I guess my question is, what are ways in which people are, you were talking about how young people get it, or get it more readily because of their life experiences. Yeah, I assumed you meant young immigrants, but I don't know if you could speak more to that. I was wondering what people are doing with that, understanding how that's being incorporated, if at all it is, in the experiences you've just had.